Excellent. So let me start sharing my screen. I'll just assume everything is going to go well. But if it's not, you can see my screen, or the resolution isn't good, or there's having any sound issues or what have you. Please let me know, because I won't be able to. I'll just keep going, and everybody will be confused then. So okay, hopefully you can see my screen by now. I'm going to start the presentation. So this session is titled "Why You Should Open an Open Source Code of Conduct." So a brief introduction of myself. My name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. To some extent, I will be putting that hat on because this is an important topic for Microsoft. And we'll talk about the topic and motivation in just a moment as well. But actually, I'm going to be making this presentation pretty much on behalf of an organization that I helped started some years ago. It's called the Jakarta Ambassadors. I won't talk about the Jakarta Ambassadors too directly here. I'll be making, in the examples, I'll be using the Jakarta Ambassadors as an example. But mostly I'm actually delivering this talk on behalf of that group, because this is actually more pertinent. It's pertinent in many different situations, but it's actually most pertinent in a situation like that, where you really have an open source community-driven organization, where you need to ensure a healthy ecosystem, healthy and diverse ecosystem. So what is this talk about? I think the title is literally self-explanatory, but let me explain it a bit more. What we will be talking about here is the importance of codes of conduct. And I think these days, many of us see these codes of conduct here. If you join a organization, or if you join even a conference, you're asked to take a look at here's our code of conduct. But in reality, very few people understand why that is. Like, what is the actual importance of a code of conduct? Maybe at the surface level we do, but at a deeper level, we really don't. And this is a serious problem for two reasons. Number one, if you really don't understand why the code of conduct is in place, you won't really follow it. You'll follow it by the spirit of the law, as we say here in the United States, but not the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. You won't be following the real intent behind it. And if you don't really understand why these codes of conduct are important, where they don't exist, you won't sort of become an advocate of putting a code of conduct in place. And even this day and age, there's a lot of places out there that doesn't really have a code of conduct, and it's shocking. And you'll see in a moment why this is really a bad idea. Right? In today's day and age, if we care about openness, if we care about diversity, if you care about a healthy ecosystem, this is almost a must. So there aren't very many cases where technology, open source, and diversity and inclusion topics intersect, but this is definitely one of them. So if you care about D&I, presumably you do if you're in this session, this is something you really need to have a deeper understanding of and a deeper level of thinking of. And this is sort of my intent, to begin you along this journey to understand why these things are important and why they're so key. So all of my contact information is there. I'm happy to talk to you about this topic. You can reach out to me via email. You can DM me on Twitter, what have you. Right? There's many other ways of getting in touch with me. You can even call me if you like. I have a website. On the website, there's even my phone number. We can even have an in-person chat about these things. In fact, definitely, I would love to do that. If I did that, I would count this a success of this talk. So first, I do want to come at this from a somewhat personal perspective, and I've debated back and forth whether I should include this slide in this talk or not. But frankly speaking, I have decided that yes, it is important. It is important for two reasons. One reason is that you should understand why the person delivering this talk is delivering this talk in the first place. Because I'll tell you, these diversity and inclusion topics, they don't have a lot of social capital. When you talk about these things, often you get a whole bunch of resistance. So most people that are choosing this topic, there's a personal context. There's a personal reason why they're doing it. The other reason, I share this slide is also to ground you to some extent, right? So it's one thing talking about these topics from a philosophical standpoint or an abstract standpoint. It's yet another when I talk about these topics from where there's a personal connection, where you really feel like, hey, this is a real person that has encountered these sorts of things in life. And this is a real problem to solve. And believe it or not, this is all stuff in these settings, right? In these settings where either a code of conduct has been in place, or it isn't in place, or it just basically, things that are there that people are just not thinking, that, okay, this is, there's some ground rules here. There's some things that I should not be doing. And so believe it or not, these are all examples like out of my real life, right? And you might find some of this shocking, but believe it or not, this is the truth. And it's very far from sort of just a personal experience of me as an individual developer and somebody who's been involved in open source for some time and seeing these things in motion, right? These sorts of occurrences in motion. If you zoom out a bit and you look at the data, right, it's very crystal clear that this is a fundamental problem, right? We may not admit to it, but in reality, these sorts of things are really a problem that do exist in our industry. In particular, they exist in open source. So I'll share with you some data here. So this is some data gathered by opensourcesurvey.org a few years ago. I believe it's from 2019. So it's not super new data, but it's new enough, right? And basically what they're trying to do is measure the health, the culture of open source in general. Right? So you can take a look at some of this data. Now I'm talking about the data that says negative behavior in open source, that particular diagram. So you can see how prevalent this actually is, right? So rudeness, almost close to half of the people that are engaged in open source in some shape or manner, they've witnessed rudeness, and as many as a quarter, that means almost 1 in 4 people have experienced rudeness themselves. Okay, and that's just the beginning. There is, things like name calling, serious incidents. That's 15%, right? That's 1 in almost 5 people that have seen serious incidents happen in open source. Imagine that, right? If that was your work environment and 1 in 5 people in your work environment has witnessed a serious incident, what kind of environment that is, right? And there's much more to this than that. There's another thing that I pointed out here, the Geek Feminism Wiki. You can take a look at that. And it basically, there's a place called Timeline of Incidents. And basically this outlines public incidents where women have experienced harassment in one way or the other, again, in the open source domain. And it is, when you look at it, you don't know if you should laugh or whether you should be sad or what it is. But this, again, is all stuff that happens in real life. And this, of course, in addition to the big headline-making things, right? The New York Times, or the New Yorker talking about some of the incidences with somebody that so many people see as a hero, Linus Torvalds, behaving in ways that are very, very abusive, right? Literally, like abusive is a word that is used to describe those kind of behaviors. Business Insider describing how women that are talking about sexist culture themselves are subject to sexist harassment, right? So this is the norm in our industry. It's actually not an exception. And really, we should be very concerned about why these things are, this is our reality. For in the online world, this is the reality we live in, especially in open source. And all of that ultimately has a net impact. Okay, so if you look at, for example, a GitHub survey that I referenced here, 95% of this contribution that are happening on GitHub are men. Okay, 3% are women. Similarly, if you look at in the United States, the IT professional field, in there, almost a third of people, almost 40% of people, identify as a national or ethnic minority. Okay, when you look at open source, on the other hand, it's half that number. So it's roughly 15 to 16% of people identify as a national, ethnic, or minority, right? So basically a huge discrepancy there, huge drop off, right? Versus the field in general, compared with who is actually contributing to open source. So there's a very serious problem here that we really need to think about, and think about how do we solve this problem. And it should be self-explanatory to you, and I'll explain it in a moment what the connection is between diversity and inclusion and this issue of sort of bad behavior, poor conduct in open source. But let's step back a second and really concretely talk about what is the problem, right? If we accept that this is reality, or at least some version of reasonable reality, what are the problems that arise from that? And why we should care about this and attempt to fix this problem. So first and foremost, the word open, the term open source starts with the word open. Okay, so what we have to do to strive in open source and truly make it successful is not only allow access to everyone, but make sure that everybody has equal access to this world of open source and the world of open technologies. But when you have these sorts of problems, when you have behavioral issues that relate to code of conduct, in reality, what happens is it effectively shuts the door on many people. That, like I said, you look at those statistics before, 3% women, right, roughly about 10 or 15% ethnic minorities. So in effect, what we're doing is by tolerating this sort of environment, we're shutting the door on openness. So if we truly care about openness and we want to live up to that first word in the term open source, we have to tackle this issue. Secondly, what happens is by essentially creating an environment where not everybody is in an equal footing and not everybody wants to participate, ultimately you lose out on important perspectives, important data points, right? One of the key value propositions of open source is to gather input, right? To gather feedback from as many people as you can and as diverse of people as you can. Well, if you don't have the diversity to begin with in your project, you're not going to get that input. You're only going to get a particular set of input, and it's going to skew your product or whatever it is that you're trying to do, your open source venture, in a particular direction that is ultimately not applicable to the broadest set of people possible. And that brings us to our next point, which is untapped potential, right? So not only will you not get input from these folks, you also won't be able to get participation from these folks. You won't be able to get those contributions. And oftentimes, I'll be honest with you, people outside of our normal range of North America and Europe, in places like Asia or Africa, if you could engage those people, you actually get very good output out of them, right? Because they often are very motivated to help you. They're often, not, dealing with a lot of different complexities that we often do in North America and Europe. So if you can get these contributors, they're actually often very good contributors. But what happens is if you don't facilitate the environment where those people can come in, it ultimately leads to an untapped potential, okay, that you could be plugging into. Similarly, you're also losing out on your user base, right? If your product doesn't represent the broadest possible perspective and hence solving the right problems, you also won't be going into those markets at all, right? So if you look at majority of products that come to market for in North America and Europe, one of the communities that are chronically underserved is African Americans, right? They're just not interested in these products. The reason for this is that the product probably doesn't have input from those folks, right? And hence they're not interested in it. Same thing for things like gaming, very, very male-dominated industry, because the entire product development is driven by men, not a lot of input from women. And ultimately, it never taps into that whole potential of female gamers. So female gamers are still a very small number compared to men. If you don't believe on any of these things, honestly, the one thing that we should all care about, and I believe most folks in our field do care about this, is the ethical imperative, right? Even if you don't believe in any of these things, it's simply not the right thing to have an environment where we did not strive to have open access and equal access to everyone. And because of these environment that we have created and we tolerate, we're not able to truly be equal, right, and have equal access to everyone. So the most important thing is perhaps just an ethical imperative to do the right thing. So let's pretend for a moment that you are all convinced this is a real issue and we really need to solve it, because if we don't solve it, we are fundamentally missing out and we are less successful as a community or as an endeavor in achieving whatever it is that our objective is. At a deeper level, you need to understand not only why solving this is important, but why do these problems actually occur? And a lot of folks, while they at a philosophical level understand that, okay, these are problems that need to be solved, don't actually think about what the underlying factors are, right? What is it that causes these things to happen? Are we just a bunch of bad people? That's not really the case. It's not as simplistic as that. And most human endeavors are not as simplistic as that. There's a complex set of factors that play into why open source culture is the way it is. By the way, I'm going to stop for a moment here and check for my chat. I don't know if I was very clear and the host was very clear about this. If you have any questions or questions or clarifications on any of this content, we do have enough time to talk about that. And I do want to talk about that very openly. So feel free to post your questions or comments in the chat. Otherwise, if you're also comfortable, you can simply come off mute and make your comment or make your or ask your question to me directly. Okay, I do want this session to be interactive and not just me telling you these things, but also your reactions and your questions and your comments on some of this content is also very valuable. So feel free to participate throughout. No need to wait until the very end of the session. Either post your question in the chat. I'm going to look at the chat. Or just simply come off mute and ask me the question directly. So either way is perfectly fine. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the underlying factors, and there's a number of these, but I'll pick out some of the key ones. One of the reasons why all of this happens is the medium. Often what happens is things, we all have our different environments, right? So we have our day job. The day job is often in an office setting. Even if it's a virtual office setting, it's an office setting, and then we go out and do this open source contribution, but that is actually in a different forum altogether. Okay, that's outside of our day-to-day job often. And what that happens is that because all of that is often online, it creates a sense of anonymity or remoteness or otherness, right? It's sort of an alternate reality, right? This is not my day-to-day job, this is not my quote-unquote real life, but this is some other kind of life. And whether we do it subconsciously or consciously, we think of this as a different world with a different set of rules, where the considerations that you would normally have in the workplace or considerations that you would have dealing with somebody in person, all those considerations are somehow diluted or forgotten about altogether. Okay. Similarly, we think that this online open source space, particularly social media space, is an anarchy, that there is no rules, you can do whatever it is that you want. And there is no consequences for your actions. There's complete impunity as to, you can do whatever you want and nobody's going to tell you anything. This is another reason why. Right? So if you can imagine a society that is based on law and order versus a society where there is no rules and there's simply anarchy, it's going to be the law of the jungle. Right? It's like survival of the strongest. Right? And that's not the kind of environment that's going to foster inclusion and foster openness. Finally, what I've observed over many, many years is in online communities have a way of forming what's called their own social bubbles. Okay, another way of thinking about this is cliques or tribes, right? It's like it's sort of my group. Right? This is my identity, my turf. This is the sort of belief. This is the sort of thing we believe in. And when you get into that mindset, it creates the idea of the other. Okay, it says it's us and them, right? We love this open source product, and then there's everybody else. We believe in this open source method, this methodology, and then there's everybody else. It creates this us versus them dynamic. And when you create that kind of dynamic, it's by definition creating exclusion, right? You're going to begin to think of people as not equal, and some people you feel more strongly affiliated to, and some other people that you don't. There's this other sense of idea of utopian meritocracy and equality, right? So I hear this quite a bit when I talk to techies, and I talk to techies about issues of diversity and inclusion, and even topics of open source codes of conduct. And the argument goes something along those lines. Yes, we know that the world is an unfair place and society is unequal and whatnot, but techies are different, right? The tech world is somehow isolated from all that, and we are a meritocracy, and we've already achieved DNI, and everybody. First of all, that's a debatable point. Let me tell you, it's not true, right? So techies are not necessarily all that different from, not that different from overall society. Can everybody still hear me? Can somebody please tell me if my internet connection is still holding up? Are you still able to see my screen? I'm getting a warning of an unstable connection. Can someone please confirm? Let me double check by just opening up a browser window. Yep, my internet connection is still stable. Okay, thank you, folks. I appreciate that. So that is first of all, that's not really true, as I mentioned, right? Tech is not that different. There's different types of people that all have different social contexts and have different belief systems. It's not like everybody in tech is a liberal. That's not true, first of all. But let's assume for a second that that was true. All right, that in tech somehow it's special, and where we especially care about diversity and inclusion and equality and openness. Well, guess what? If you are a minority, you're a woman, or you have a disability, or you're an ethnic or racial minority, while that may be true, right? Then that when you're going into tech, things are somehow nicer than society in general. Guess what? You still live in society in general, right? So you've lived a great majority of your life, right, in society at large. And outside of your open source contribution, outside of maybe your day job, you still live in a society that is very, very much unequal. So in reality, you are subjected to that inequality outside of the tech space, okay? And ultimately that results in differences in how you are as an individual, even if you are dealing with the so-called tech utopia. So in other words, you've already dealt with many different inequalities in life. You've already dealt with many challenges that you normally wouldn't have to if you're part of the dominant culture. And you're often more isolated in society, right? You have less of a support structure. You probably are less affluent, less educated, right? You have less of a professional network. So all of those disadvantages you're still bringing into the equation, right? So while tech may be a very nice place, maybe, if there is still inequalities, those inequalities disproportionately affect certain groups, whereas they don't others. Okay, so this is the a picture that I have on the bottom of the screen here, explaining the difference between equality, equity, right? What do we need to do to make things equal? So we may in some cases need to go out of our way a little bit and put things in place like the code of conduct that make things more equal. Okay, when we know that things are not equal in society, And ultimately, hopefully one day we get to a point of liberation where you really, you don't need a code of conduct. I don't frankly see that happening anytime soon, right? But I do hear that it's argument at some point in time. Hey, why do we need a code of conduct at all? Things are so great and so on. Finally, we do need to talk about the ugly truth, right? So the reality of whether we like it or not, there is deliberate stereotyping and bias, and there's unconscious stereotyping and bias. And there's a lot of soft tests that you can take, and I took a few of them. And believe it or not, when I take those tests, what those tests tell me is I have subconscious biases that I don't realize, right? I have subconscious biases against women. I have subconscious biases against African Americans and many other groups, right? In fact, I have not taken a single test like that that has told me I don't have a bias. So the reality of whether we realize it or not, we all have different biases, and those biases can turn very ugly if there is no rules, right? If there's no established norms of what is acceptable conduct and what is not. So these are the fundamental dynamics that we need to understand. So when you understand those dynamics well, you can bring those perspectives into solving the problem. Okay. Now here's the good news. The reality is we as a society have dealt with these sorts of problems for a very long time. And we actually in general know how to solve these problems. In fact, since the dawn of civilization, we've dealt with these exact same dynamics where we know that we as humans, we as society have some limitations. So if we don't put in mitigation steps, if we don't put things in place that helps us overcome our limitations, we won't be able to overcome them. This is the reality of it. And this is why actually things like codes of conduct pervade our entire lives, whether we realize it or not. There's all kinds of codes of conduct all over the place. The very first one is probably something called the Hammurabi's laws. The Geneva Conventions. Before the Geneva Conventions, there was no rules of code of conduct as to what you do in a conflict situation, right? As a result, it resulted in many different tragedies. That's why the Geneva Conventions are in place today. Religion, believe it or not, really is just a set of code of conduct. Whether you're looking at the 10 Commandments or the Hindu way of life or the 5 pillars of Islam, in reality, these things are all doing the same thing, right? They recognize a weakness in human nature, they recognize a weakness in human society, and they try to formulate guidelines of or codes of conduct to correct those things, right, towards more justice and more equality. Same thing for the Hippocratic Oath, right? All of these things exist for those same reasons. Before the Hippocratic Oath, people practice medicine in very, very harmful ways, right? This is the reason why the Hippocratic Oath was put in place, is to do no harm. First rule is do no harm. Okay, so codes of conduct are a very normal thing. And it is a very acceptable way of solving the type of dynamic that we have here with open source codes of conduct as well. The problems are the same. We have a social setting, open source. We have a set of problems that arise because of the particular societal dynamics of that environment. We know what the issues are, and we need to essentially mitigate those problems by setting standards, right? By saying what is acceptable and behavior that we want to aim towards and what is unacceptable behavior. So here's the good news. In terms of open source codes of conduct, you don't have to invent these things. And back in the days of let's say Linus Torvalds, this was unknown. Okay, somebody needed to invent what a code of conduct should look like for open source and figure out how to solve all of these problems. The good news for us is that has already been done, right? In fact, it was done by essentially minorities in the open source space. They did all of the legwork to say, this is really how an open source code of conduct should look like, and this is what we should adopt for this particular problem domain. And there's many different well understood ones out there already. The one that I'm going to highlight for today is something called a contributor covenant. Okay, it is the most well adopted code of conduct in the world for open source projects, and it's a very good one. Okay, so you know, you don't even have to think about what kind of open source code of conduct you need to adopt, because that work's already been done for you. All right. So what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of something like the contributor covenant, and what makes an effective code of conduct? So first and foremost, a code of conduct should be clear and simple, right? You shouldn't need to. You should be able to take a look at it. Any person that is involved in the project or initiative should be able to take a look at it and very clearly understand. I get it. Right? This is what it's trying to tell me, and it is telling me in a very simple and straightforward fashion. So no jargon or complicated concepts. Very simple things, right? Clear and simple. Believe it or not, if you look at the Ten Commandments or most of the religious codes of religious rules, or even things like the Geneva Convention, those are also expressed in very simple terms. Okay, it has to be concrete principles and objectives. What are you after, right? What are your objectives, right? What do you want to accomplish? What are your principles? What do you value, right? There should be some statement around that, because ultimately this helps us gain alignment, right? So you know what you're getting into and why. If you have a particular initiative, these are its objectives. This is what it believes in. It does need to be sufficiently detailed and include concrete examples, right? So while we do want to strive for clarity and simplicity does not mean brevity, right? It does not mean short. You know, the infamous one that people cite from the Linux Foundation is be excellent to each other. It was one word code of conduct. And of course, it's not sufficient. It's you know, it results in things like Linus Torvalds and abusive emails, because his interpretation of what is excellent to each other is very different from the people that are receiving nasty messages, right? So it does need to be sufficiently detailed. Okay, it needs to be clear, simple, but also detailed, and in some cases, it should include specific examples. Okay, to say, okay, this is what we mean by this, right? In addition to that, there should be resources to seek clarification. While we want to strive for all of these things, sometimes we just can't achieve them, right? So if there's any kind of lack of clarity, there should be a way to seek clarity, right? Beyond the code of conduct itself, if I want clarity on the code of conduct, where do I go? Finally, a code of conduct is meaningless if there is no enforcement of it, right? So this is the probably the most common pitfalls that I observe. It's like we have a code of conduct. By the way, nobody ever observes it. Nobody ever enforces it. This is a meaningless code of conduct altogether. Okay, I see many open source projects that do this. They have a code of conduct, but in reality, you go to their forums, you go to their GitHub issues, and it's a very abrasive, confrontational dialogue that obviously is not a very open and inclusive environment. And it's because nobody's actually enforcing the code of conduct. They just posted it and they're done with it. So a code of conduct, in order to be effective, does need to be enforced. You need to figure out who does the enforcement in a transparent and open fashion, and it needs to have some enforcement details, right? What are the consequences? Right? What happens if you break the code of conduct? And it also needs to be prominently placed. This is another thing that I see in many places. Like the code of conduct is buried very deep somewhere. Like you can't really find it unless you're really looking for it. It's almost hidden. That can't be the case. Right? If you really believe in a code of conduct, it needs to be very prominently placed, where you say, hey, this is our code of conduct. Please read this before you join our community. Okay. So let's take a look at a concrete example of all these things. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of these principles a little bit. We talked about the contributor code of conduct. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the specific details in the context of the Jakarta ambassador. So let's go open up this website. Let me see if I can press escape here and get to my browser. Here's the browser. Okay, so this is the Jakarta ambassador site. If you're not familiar with the Jakarta ambassadors, it's basically a grassroots level community that contributes towards towards Jakarta-E and to lesser extent microprofile. It's an independent group. It's not affiliated with the Eclipse Foundation. It's its own thing. Okay, and it is completely volunteer driven. Like nobody gets paid to do anything with the Jakarta ambassadors. It is completely everybody's free time. Okay, so this is open source at its purest. All right. So in here, if you look at the website, right where you have the getting involved section. Okay, so you have the introduction of what the group is, right? What are we about? And then right in the getting involved section, it says, okay, how do you get involved, right? These are different ways you can get involved. And right here, very prominently, it says, hey, we have a code of conduct, right? We have an objective of creating a healthy environment where we can talk about, everybody can talk about in their free time how to advance Jakarta-E, and we aim to be a professional civil environment and a respectable environment. And by the way, you should be reading our code of conduct. Okay, so it's very prominently placed. So in case of the Jakarta ambassadors, again, what we adopt as our code of conduct is simply the contributor covenant. In fact, we saw no need to alter the contributor covenant in any way. Right? Our code of conduct is exactly what the contributor code of conduct, what a contributor code of conduct is okay. But there's some details around that, right? So we talk about what the Jakarta ambassadors are, why it's important for us to have a code of conduct. What code of conduct are we adopting? In this case, it's a contributor covenant that we are adopting, and also enforcement details. Okay, so we talked about how will who will enforce the code of conduct, where they will enforce it, what are some of the consequences of not following the code of conduct, and finally, if you have any questions or if you want to report a code of conduct issue, this is how you do it. Right? This is who you reach out to. So now let's take a look at the contributor code of conduct itself, and we basically have posted a copy of it, link to a copy of it here, right? So this talks about what the contributor code of conduct is. It talks about some of its context, but let's take a look at its actual content. Okay, so actually that's not very readable, is it? Let's take a look at maybe the HTML version. Okay, so the contributor code of conduct it's very succinct, right? So if you can see, it's not very long. It's not pages and pages, right? It's just a very small set of things. It talks about what the concrete actions are, right? What the enforcement guidelines are. And by the way, in the Jakarta ambassadors, we follow these guidelines exactly. But it's not very long, right? It's very relatively short. Let me see here. Okay, but the heart of it is this. Okay, so the heart of it is the pledge. Okay, what are our principles? What are we after? What do we believe in? Okay, so it talks about that in a very succinct fashion, and then it talks about the guidelines, the actual code, the actual standards, right? What are the kind of behaviors that we want to encourage? Okay, so demonstrating empathy and kindness towards other people, being respectful of different opinions, giving and receiving constructive feedback. Okay, not just destructive feedback, but constructive feedback. Accepting responsibility when you've made a mistake. Focusing on what is best for us and not just for individuals, but the overall community. Examples of unacceptable behavior. Okay, use of sexualized language or imagery. Trolling, insulting, or derogatory comments, and this is by far the most common thing that ever happens. Okay, personal or political attacks, private or public harassment, publishing others' information, and this is a very important one. Okay, so other conduct which could reasonably considered as inappropriate in a professional setting. Okay, so this is raising the bar. Right? It's telling us we are not just a community, but actually our environment is the same as a professional setting, a professional working setting. Okay, so it's basically telling you very directly what kind of expectations should you have out of this environment. And of course, there's the enforcement responsibilities and what have you. But believe it or not, this is enough, right? This is a code of conduct that has been time tested and proven, and it is effective enough, right? If you just adopt this, you're in good shape. So let's go look at further, and let's talk about a few more important elements of open source codes of conduct. Okay, so I talked a lot about open source communities, right? So basically, if you have an open source project, hopefully it's obvious why you should have a code of conduct and hopefully how you should apply it. But believe it or not, it's not just for open source projects, right? There's actually a lot of applicability of codes of conduct outside of just open source projects. And actually people do apply it in that sense. So you could apply something like the code of conduct for communities and groups. So for example, if you have an informal group like a Java user group, okay, or something like the ambassadors, Jakarta ambassadors, those are communities. Those are not necessarily open source projects where you produce some kind of software, but these are simply communities and groups. If you want them to be healthy, you should adopt a open source code of conduct there. It is definitely for conferences and events also, and most conferences and events do actually apply an open source code of conduct. So I have a few examples here. The Eclipse Foundation is an example where it is a community or a group where they do adopt an open source code of conduct, and it happens to be the contributor covenant again. Many different conferences, including this one, will have a code of conduct as well, very clearly posted. I have an example here of the developer conference, which is actually a female-led conference out of Brazil. So naturally, they were one of the very first to adopt a code of conduct. In fact, I have a policy myself that I don't participate in a conference unless it does have a code of conduct in it. And believe it or not, it's also applicable to companies. I'll explain to you why that is. First of all, a lot of open source is actually hosted by companies. So in case of Microsoft, for example, we have a lot of GitHub projects out there. A lot of our work is actually done in open source. So it absolutely makes sense for us to adopt a code of conduct, and we do, right? So the Microsoft open source code of conduct, which again is nothing much more than the contributor covenant, actually applies to every single thing that Microsoft does in terms of open source work. And also the fact that there's a lot of companies that pay people to be going and doing open source, right? So this, having an open source code of conduct like this, is a signal to those people as well. It's like if you're getting paid to do open source in your day job, even if it's outside the company, you still should be mindful of these codes of conduct, even if the project itself that you're contributing to doesn't have one. Okay, so in all of these situations, you should be asking either yourself or the people responsible for either a community, conference, or a company, do you have an open source code of conduct, right? If not, why not, right? These are the reasons why you should. So hopefully you take that away with you as a result of this talk, and at least check to say, hey, is there a code of conduct, right? And if not, maybe work towards enforcing one. Okay, so I'm going to finish up this talk. I'll leave just about 5 minutes for any kind of a Q&A that you guys may want to have with me. Obviously, this is a sensitive topic. If you want to reach out to me out of band and have a conversation there, I'm okay to have that private conversation with you as well. Codes of conduct is one of the very clear places where technology and D&I, diversity and inclusion topics, do intersect. Okay, it's if there's one topic in D&I in technology that is important, it is this one. None of it is unknown, right? We all know how to do this now because we've been struggling through and learned some hard lessons for close to 2 decades. Okay, so it is all very well understood to me, right? So, and I've given you some pointers to that, and I'll leave some resources behind for you as well. And it has wider applicability than open source. It's absolutely applicable to open source projects, but it actually is applicable much beyond open source as well. Okay, so here's some resources for you to find out more about this. The contributor covenant itself is a great resource. I've left a link to that. There's also talk about, there's a similar type of guide in the open source guide for codes of conduct. Okay, and this talks about many different practices in open source, code of conduct being one of them. All right, so this is a slightly more detailed resource that you can also take a look at. And finally, the broader topic of diversity in open source software, that's a very complicated topic. And in fact, it's a talk all on its own. I've talked to you a little bit about the key topics at the very beginning of this session. But if you want to find out more about this, honestly, the Wikipedia entry for diversity in open source has some pretty good links in it. Right? You could follow that and follow all the very nice articles and resources that are out there that talks about diversity in open source software in particular.